Bikers humiliate and spit in elderly black man's coffee, unaware. He's a Vietnam veteran. It was a chilly, overcast morning at a small roadside diner, the kind of place where people stop for a quick coffee on their way to somewhere else. The bell above the door jingled as an elderly black man slowly walked inside. His movements were careful, his hands steady despite his age, and he wore a worn-out military jacket with faded patches sewn on. His face was etched with lines of experience and resilience, though anyone could tell that life hadn't always been easy for him. He took a seat at the counter, nodding politely to the waitress, who smiled and asked what he'd like. "Just a coffee, please," he said in a soft voice, folding his hands on the counter. The man quietly sipped his coffee, his eyes distant, as if lost in memories of a time long past. Little did anyone around him know that this wasn't just an ordinary, elderly man. This was a Vietnam War veteran, a man who had served his country with bravery and honor decades ago. His jacket told part of his story, but his demeanor revealed little of the battles he had fought, both in war and in life. It wasn't long before the sound of roaring motorcycles filled the parking lot outside, the ground vibrating with their arrival. A group of bikers, rough and tough looking, pulled up and parked their bikes carelessly near the entrance. They swaggered into the diner, loud and brash, their leather jackets and heavy boots making it clear that they didn't care who noticed them. As the group made their way to the counter, one of the younger bikers, a man with tattoos snaking up his arms and a mocking grin plastered across his face, spotted the elderly man sipping his coffee. He nudged his friend, pointing at the man with a sneer. "Look at this old guy," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The others chuckled, and before long, the group of bikers gathered around the elderly man, towering over him. Their laughter grew louder, and the mood in the diner shifted. What had been a quiet, peaceful morning was now filled with tension. The waitress glanced nervously toward the scene, unsure whether to intervene. One of the bikers leaned in close, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, old man, you're sitting in our spot," he said, even though there were plenty of other seats available. The elderly man looked up slowly, his calm gaze meeting the biker's aggressive stare. He didn't say a word, just held the man's gaze with quiet strength. But the bikers weren't looking for respect. They were looking for trouble. Before anyone could stop him, the leader of the group grabbed the man's coffee mug, lifted it to his lips, and, without a hint of shame, spat into it. The diner fell silent as the rest of the bikers roared with laughter, finding amusement in their cruelty. The elderly man, still calm, looked down at his now ruined cup of coffee. He didn't flinch, didn't react with anger or fear. Instead, he slowly pushed the mug aside and folded his hands again. But the bikers weren't done yet. Another one of them, with a rough voice and an attitude to match, leaned in even closer. "What's the matter, old man? Not gonna say anything?" he taunted. The group was enjoying themselves, completely unaware of who they were dealing with. To them, he was just an easy target, someone they could push around without consequence. Yet behind the man's calm exterior was a lifetime of courage, of facing far greater challenges than these men could imagine. He had seen things they wouldn't believe, fought in a war that had left scars both visible and hidden. But to the bikers, he was just another old man. As the tension in the room grew thicker, the door to the diner opened again, and a figure stepped inside. This time, it was someone who recognized the man, someone who knew his story. But the bikers were too wrapped up in their own cruel game to notice. The elderly man sat still, his expression unchanged, as if waiting for the right moment. And in that moment, the air seemed to hold its breath, as everyone wondered what would happen next. Would he stand up to these bullies? Or would they continue their torment, unaware of the storm they were about to unleash? Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where the truth about this quiet old man will change everything. The diner remained quiet as the tension continued to build. The elderly man, still seated calmly, seemed almost untouched by the bikers' disrespectful actions. But something was stirring beneath the surface. A silent force of resolve and dignity that hadn't been broken, even by their cruelty. The other patrons, who had been quietly watching from the corners of the room, couldn't help but feel sympathy for the man. He was clearly outnumbered, and these bikers showed no signs of stopping. The waitress, now visibly nervous, darted her eyes toward the door. She recognized the man who had just walked in, the figure who had noticed what was high. This new arrival was a middle-aged man, slightly worn, but with an air of familiarity. He knew exactly who the elderly man was, and he wasn't going to let things escalate without stepping in. But before he could say anything, the leader of the bikers leaned in even closer to the elderly man. His voice, dripping with mockery, cut through the silence. "So what's your deal, old man? Too weak to defend yourself? Or just scared?" The elderly man slowly raised his eyes and for the first time spoke. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that demanded attention. "Scared? No. I've been through worse than this," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had seen things far beyond the understanding of the men towering over him. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. The elderly man continued, his voice steady. "I fought for this country when I was your age. I saw brothers in arms fall right next to me. I survived things that most people can't even imagine. And all for the freedom that lets you sit here today, spitting in my coffee." The leader of the bikers blinked, momentarily taken aback by the man's words, but the sneer on his face didn't fade. He scoffed, clearly not impressed. "Vietnam, huh?" he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Big deal. That was a long time ago. We're living in a different world now, old man." But what the bikers didn't know, what they couldn't understand, was that some battles never truly end. The elderly man's time in Vietnam had left scars that ran deep. He had returned home to a country that wasn't kind to veterans, especially black veterans. Instead of honor, he had faced discrimination. Instead of gratitude, he had been met with indifference. And yet, he had survived all of it, carrying his dignity and pride, even when the world tried to strip it away. The middle-aged man who had entered the diner knew all of this. He had grown up hearing stories about the old man, stories passed down through the neighborhood. This elderly man wasn't just a veteran, he was a hero, someone who had quietly helped many people in the community over the years. The man at the door hesitated, sensing that something big was about to happen, but unsure if he should intervene just yet. Meanwhile, the bikers were growing impatient. They didn't care about the old man's past. To them, he was just another easy target, someone they could bully for fun. The leader smirked and crossed his arms, standing even taller over the seated man. "You really think your war stories matter here? Look around, no one's coming to help you." For the first time, the elderly man's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something powerful passing through his eyes. He glanced up at the leader, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right. This isn't a war zone, but don't mistake my silence for weakness." One of the younger bikers, emboldened by his leader, stepped forward and slapped the man's military cap off his head, sending it tumbling onto the floor. Laughter erupted from the group, and the waitress took a step back, her hands shaking. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, but the elderly man didn't react with violence. He slowly bent down, picked up his cap, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The middle-aged man at the door clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew that if things escalated, the situation could get out of hand quickly. But before he could act, the leader of the bikers made his final move. Without warning, he reached for the man's jacket, tugging at the worn military patches sewn onto the fabric. "Let's see if this jacket of yours is as tough as you think," the biker sneered, preparing to rip it off the man's shoulders. But as his hand tightened around the collar, the elderly man's grip shot up like lightning, faster than anyone expected. His hand locked onto the biker's wrist with surprising strength for someone his age. The entire diner went still, the laughter dying instantly. The biker's eyes widened in shock as he tried to pull his arm free, but the old man held firm, his gaze unwavering. There was no anger in his eyes, just calm, collected control. "I've had enough," the elderly man said quietly, his voice carrying an edge now. For the first time, the leader of the bikers looked truly unnerved. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like this. The silence in the diner was deafening, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The middle-aged man by the door could feel it. Something was about to break. The elderly man's quiet strength had turned the tide. But no one knew how this moment would play out. Would the bikers back down, realizing they had underestimated him? Or would things escalate, leading to a confrontation they couldn't take back? The suspense hung in the air, thick and heavy. As everyone waited for the next move, the diner seemed frozen in time. The elderly man's grip on the biker's wrist was firm yet calm. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. The leader of the bikers, clearly startled by the unexpected strength and the unwavering gaze of the man, tried to yank his arm free, but it didn't budge. The shock on his face spread to the rest of the group. No one had expected this. To them, he was just an easy target, a harmless old man they could intimidate for a laugh. But now, they realized they had made a mistake. This wasn't just any man. This was someone who had seen far worse than they could imagine. Someone who had faced true adversity and emerged stronger because of it. The elderly man's voice, calm and measured, cut through the tension like a knife. "I've been through worse than you can imagine," he said quietly. "I've survived things that would make you think twice about how tough you are. But I'm not here to hurt anyone." He slowly released the biker's wrist, his hand returning to his lap. The leader stepped back, rubbing his wrist, clearly unnerved, but too proud to back down entirely. He glanced around at his friends, trying to regain his confidence. But the atmosphere had shifted. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't in control. The middle-aged man by the door finally stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "You all need to leave now," he said firmly, his eyes on the bikers. "Before you get yourselves into something you can't handle." The leader of the group looked around the diner, noticing for the first time the stares from the other customers. The bikers, once full of bravado, were suddenly aware of how outnumbered they were. Not just by people, but by the sense of justice that now filled the room. Without a word, the leader turned and nodded to his friends. One by one, the bikers began to back away, their earlier arrogance fading as they shuffled toward the exit. They had come in looking for trouble, but now they were leaving, having lost not just the fight they thought they'd win, but a piece of their pride. The door jingled as the last of them left, their motorcycles roaring to life outside. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, the diner finally relaxed. The tension that had gripped the room melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The elderly man sat still, his hands folded in his lap once more. He hadn't said much, but he hadn't needed to. His presence, his quiet dignity, had spoken volumes. The waitress came over, her hands still trembling slightly, and offered him a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. The man nodded and took the cup, offering a small smile in return. He sipped the coffee as if nothing had happened. The middle-aged man, now standing beside him, finally spoke up. "I didn't think it'd go that way," he admitted. "You really handled them." The elderly man shrugged, his voice humble. "Sometimes it's not about fighting, it's about knowing when not to." The middle-aged man sat down beside him, clearly still impressed by how the whole situation had unfolded. "I've heard stories about you, about your service. But today I saw something different. You could have put them in their place, but you chose to show restraint." The elderly man's eyes drifted toward the window, his thoughts somewhere far away. "Violence doesn't solve anything. I learned that a long time ago," he said softly. "What matters is standing your ground, but knowing when to let things go." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the words lingering in the air. Around them, the diner began to return to its usual rhythm. People talking quietly, the sound of plates clinking, and the smell of fresh coffee brewing. As the minutes passed, the middle-aged man realized something. It wasn't just the bikers who had learned a lesson today. Everyone in that diner had witnessed something powerful. It wasn't about strength or physical intimidation. It was about dignity, respect, and understanding that real power comes from within. Before leaving, the middle-aged man turned to the elderly veteran and asked, "Do you ever regret what you went through? All the hardship?" The elderly man paused for a moment, considering the question. Then, with a calm smile, he replied, "No. It taught me everything I needed to know. I'm still here, aren't I?" The man stood up, nodding in quiet respect, before heading toward the door. As he left, the elderly veteran remained at the counter, sipping his coffee, peaceful and unbothered. Outside, the sky had cleared a little, the overcast morning giving way to soft rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The bikers had come looking for trouble, but instead, they left with a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And for everyone else in that diner, it was a moment they would carry with them, a reminder that true strength doesn't always need to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes, the quietest actions speak the loudest. The elderly man took one last sip of his coffee, set the cup down, and stood up. As he walked out of the diner, his military jacket swaying gently with each step, the small patches on his jacket gleamed softly in the sunlight, a quiet reminder of who he was and all he had survived. And with that, the story of a humble Vietnam veteran who faced cruelty with grace and strength came to a close. But the lessons learned would linger long after he was gone.